welcome Kali Akuno that you can be with us. For us, it's tonight. For you, it's in the morning, I assume. The reason that we asked you to be online with us is, of course, what happened 3 weeks ago in Minneapolis and everything that happened after that. So first of all, maybe the question, what did this mean to you? Because you are in Jackson, Mississippi. You are the leader of the Jackson Corporation, which is an entity, maybe you can say something about that as well, which has been around for quite some time and which is actually governing the city of Jackson in Mississippi, which is quite extraordinary, especially for our comprehension in the Netherlands, because everybody here thinks that all of Mississippi is completely reactionary, racist, and so on. So it's a miracle that you are there. So please say something about that.
Yeah. Well, first I'll start with what we're calling the Floyd Rebellion. It's historic. I don't think there's any question about that. We haven't seen anything that rivals it since the 1960s. And even then, I don't think there were 3 continuous weeks of actions, demonstrations. Now we have people's assemblies. We have 2 kind of autonomous zones that have been set up in the northeastern part of the United States. This is remarkable. We haven't had any, the only thing I can think of would be April 1968, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and where there was a number of cities where there was such a nationwide focus. In the past, when we've had kind of these rebellions, there may be 1 or 2 cities. There may be, an action here one day, an action there another day, but nothing has ever happened to where at any given time, there's like 50 or 60 cities that are in motion every single day. And it's been that way for the greater part of 2 weeks. So this is groundbreaking, I think, for the United States. And the fact that it's gone international should not be missed. There are things happening all over the world. And we've never seen, I think, a motion like this. So for us, initially, I saw the footage of George Floyd's execution, if you would, the day it happened. Thanks to the actions of a young woman who captured everything on film and put it out, as so many in her age are, prompt to do. Share it on social media, be on the spot, eyes and ears of the people, and that's what she did. And so that really just sparked immediate rage, that kind of got expressed and rippled through social media, because it's critical to remember this didn't get spread by mainstream media, by the bourgeois press. They denied it, they downplayed it for as long as they could, right? It was young folks primarily passing it around from phone to phone that really sparked the outrage. And within, a matter of hours in Minneapolis, young folks took to the streets demanding justice. And from there, it's just been a chain reaction. Now, one of the things that I think we have to understand and put this in context, this has been building for a number of months. And I think it's really the culmination of a number of factors and things just kind of all coming together and coming to a boil. The one I think that was probably a major unknown catalyst was this vigilante execution in Georgia. And why the justice, if you consider people just being arrested justice, I think it's a step in that direction. But it took over 2 months for there to be any charges around Aubrey's execution. And there was footage by one of the assailants that was initially put up to mock his execution. But again, it was Black, progressive, independent media which picked this up and would not let it go and just kept broadcasting it day by day by day until eventually, it got picked up. It became a national sensation about 2 weeks before Floyd was killed. And in the midst of that, there was another assassination of a Black woman, Breonna, in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, on one of these, what's called a no-knock search warrants that are done in the United States, where they basically wait till they believe you're asleep in the middle of the night, break your door down, literally, and just go in, with the SWAT team to arrest you. They did that on her, when in fact they already had the person they were looking for already in custody, and gave no warning whatsoever and just, shot her over 8 times. And there's still no one who's been charged with her murder, not one police, and the files have all been redacted. So you can just imagine in the Black community, particularly amongst Black youth, and you got a generation that was nurtured on the Black Lives Matter movement. So they have been raised in the context of resistance the last 6 or 7 years. Now it kind of dipped down, but they have continued to organize, to educate themselves, to politicize. And so when this jumped around, all of these 3 incidents in particular, they were upset, they were mad, and they had tools and resources to spread their anger and communicate action steps. And that's what happened. And that was a really beautiful thing. Myself, Cooperation Jackson, the People Strike, that we helped to build to really respond to the coronavirus crisis. We all stepped into motion. And then another factor to this, I think you have to, to link the kind of the People Strike motion to this, is you've had, I don't think it's necessarily the most healthiest of expressions, but this came on the heels of folks pretty much being in lockdown for about 2.5, almost 3 months. So there was already a bunch of pent-up energy, pent-up frustration, both at the lockdown, the number of people, particularly Black people, who have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic and the economy shutting down, the anger at how well we've begun to document the impact that coronavirus had, particularly on the Black community, the Latino community, and the indigenous community, those who are getting hit hardest, but particularly the Black community. So there's just some extreme anger at the total just disposability of Black life that has been building up. And all of these things, I think, factored into the explosion that we saw, 3 weeks ago. I don't think there's one kind of thing. I think there's the accumulation of months and months of just anger, frustration that's built on centuries of anger and frustration. And I think people just said, look, we've had enough and we need change. Now, the last thing I'll say before getting to the next question, another reason why this is historic, really historic, is it's multiracial. It's not just Black people. Now typically in history, if you look at like in the 60s, well up into the 2000s, most of the outrage, the anger, the frustration, the fighting with the police, most of that has been conducted by Black folks in isolation, right? Us fighting against those forces pretty much on our own. The character of that started to change with Black Lives Matter. Young white folks in particular really started to get engaged 6 years ago and really take up the charge. And so if you measure, like, that was a beginning point, it was here, that was new, 6, 7 years ago. It's here now. And so it's critical to understand that from the beginning in Minneapolis, the action was led and sparked as a result of Black rage, but it was accompanied by everybody in Minneapolis: indigenous folks, migrant workers, transplant immigrant communities. Folks should know, like in Minneapolis, there's a large Somali refugee community, that's been there for years, which sometimes at different points have been hard pressed to kind of link up with the Black community and find some solidarity. Everybody came out in Minneapolis. And so this has a very multiracial, multinational character, and that represents a very critical political shift in the United States. Still got a long way to go in my view, given what my politics are. I think to become a real broad expression of class rage and frustration, but it's moving in that direction. And the fact that you find so many young white people, youth in particular, who also see their interests being expressed in the anger and frustration of Black people and finding common cause, and seeing, their life in the same regard. I mean, look, we've been waiting for this for a long, long time, and that was played out very heavily here in Mississippi with so many white youth in eastern parts of the state taking up action. So that was a very, very critical thing and a new development that we haven't seen here, not in my lifetime, and I think it makes it a very exciting time. But there's another backdrop to it that we need to get to, and that is another part of this is the reaction to the outright fascism that has been growing and being articulated most clearly by Trump, but he's not the only one. He's an expression of the system, and one of his worst symptoms. But he's not an aberration, and that's what I think people are really fighting back on. Where this is all headed still kind of remains to be seen, but there's plenty of space and plenty of room for everybody right now to interject, and that's what we're encouraging folks to do.
And how does this relate to the Jackson Corporation? Can you shed a few words on that?
I'm sorry, one of my neighbors just came up.
I want to the property that the lady bought. It don't belong to nobody because she wasn't legal will. And now my son graduates. Yeah, and I'm going to I gotta go.
Come talk to me. I'll be around all day tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I don't know because I'm going through the funeral. My cousin passed away in Jefferson County.
I'm sorry to hear that.
So I might be back early Sunday.
I'm here. Not going nowhere all weekend. Okay.
So
All right.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. How does all of this relate to the Jackson Corporation? Can you shed a few words on that? Today you sent me a document about the people's strike. I don't know if that is only something that the Jackson Corporation is supporting. I guess not. It's bigger than that. Maybe you can shed a few words on that as well. How does this relate to where you are right now?
In every way. I mean, so just so your audience knows, Cooperation Jackson is an outgrowth of a strategy that was put in place about 15 years ago by a number of forces that have been fighting for Black self-determination and the socialist transformation of the United States on a whole. And that plan is called the Jackson Kush Plan. And so we were born as a vehicle to execute one particular aspect of that plan, which is really building up the forces of production, really through cooperative means, right? As a means of, from the grassroots, from the bottom up, as we say, changing the social relationships and trying to build a socialist, an eco-socialist economy from below. So that's where Cooperation Jackson is basically situated in. And through that strategy, as you mentioned, our forces collectively have been able to make some pretty significant gains here, including winning the mayoralship and some significant seats on the city council to be able to try to enact, a broad set of radical to progressive policies. Now it's done in the context of Mississippi being one of the most reactionary states. That is true, but that's not true for all of it. So what you have are strong municipal movements, and particularly in the majority Black areas of the state, where there's some very significant stuff that's been going on, particularly I would say the last 10 years, but throughout our history. So we are one of the outgrowths of that. Now, in the midst of this pandemic, Cooperation Jackson put out a call at the end of March for a move towards a general strike. Right, so we were looking to take our first action on May Day, which we did, and which was highly successful, and I think is one of the more current movements in the United States that's kind of reviving the tradition of May Day. There was a big May Day march that happened in the United States in 2006. Really led by immigrant rights forces throughout in the Latino community. In 2006, that's still going on, hasn't totally petered out. And then following Trump's election, and elements of the feminist movement and the Me Too movement launched some major women's actions that happened, commencing after Trump was elected. And that's still been going on. And then this piece really emerged in the face of this pandemic, trying to respond to the Trump administrations and the right-wing governments, on the state level, which were refusing to shut their states down early on, including Mississippi, which was just spreading, the virus. And we thought then, and being proved right now, that it's taken it to catastrophic levels. So we were calling for a strike that was on the heels of a strike wave that began in March. There were a number of wildcat strikes that workers were just commencing on their own. And so we said, look, we cannot allow Trump to force the nation to go back to work too early, right? Rather than making us all victims and putting us in kill boxes by forcing people to go back to work before this pandemic, was really solved. We said that we need to use the maximum power that we have, which is the power of our labor, and send a clear message that the whole system has to change, to meet this kind of pandemic. And we were really trying to raise it on a level even globally, in truth, around another looming crisis, which is the crisis of the ecology, the climate crisis. And we've heard now since 1992 on the Rio summit, all this from all the governments all over the world in the main, we can't do anything major, to alter production or shift things or slow things down. The everything is too complicated. And we saw in the span of a month, how fast, if there's political will, everything could change, right? The global government shut everything down. So it just totally put, totally exposed that false notion and just blew that wide open. So we were trying to interject there and say, now is the time for working people all over the world to stand up in defense of ourselves, make sure that this pandemic doesn't spread, because that's who it will impact the most, are working people, and that we need to put a stop to it. And in the midst of it, really shift everything, because we're here in the United States. I followed some other places, but I'll just focus in the United States. Another thing that really got exposed, and we were trying to really educate, the general population around, was that the U.S. Federal Reserve, has just been pumping trillions of dollars into the economy to prop up Wall Street. So it's not a lack of resources, right? If they could put all that in to save the Wall Street, all of that could be reorganized and reshifted to meet what's supposed to be the other aim and objective of that institution, is ensuring full employment. So we just had to politicize it. It's not a crisis of resources. It's not a crisis of capital being limited. I mean, they're just printing monopoly money at this point. So it's a question of political will. So that's why we try to pull together the People's Strike. And so we, from the beginning of building that coalition, there's over 40 different organizations in it, and it's growing, all throughout the country, and now starting to take on an international character as well. we were calling for what are called first strike actions, right? We knew, particularly in the United States, just calling for a general strike on May Day would be somewhat absurd because you got to build your forces, build the organizing capacity. So we're calling for these, what we call first strike actions at the first of every month, that people stop work, hold people's assemblies, educate their workers, struggle to raise their conscience, build trade unions. And this is a critical thing because, you know, I want your audience to know that in the United States, you know, the trade union movement is almost, I'm not going to say dead, but it's in a very weakened position. Only 10% of U.S. labor, you know, is organized in a trade union.
Yeah.
That means 90%, the vast majority, are not in trade unions. So that's something that we were calling for. Now that we did May Day, as I mentioned, and then on June 1st, we had the second kind of first strike action, but that just dovetailed in with the George Floyd Rebellion. So those two have merged, and that statement that you had is our kind of best thinking and analysis on how do we merge these two motions and where do we go from here. That's what that call that came out from the People Strike, that's what it's really about. And we're trying to get that out to really sharpen up the ideas on how to carry the struggle forward in the future.
Okay, great. I'll translate it and spread it in Dutch. Now Bart has a question for you.
Oh, really? No, I just interjected to say people who are a member of the trade unions, police people, for instance, they're in the union. It's all in our country as well.
Okay.
And the union has a very strange role also, not what you expect of a union to do for their membership. But that's a bit of a side note. Another thing that you said, it's that it's spread out, say, across the races, and that's, I think, is a thing that the system or the evil bad system never wants. Is that there's if you see these speeches by Fred Hampton, this Black Panther who was murdered by the cops, it was kind of half white audience he spoke to,
right?
Because he was really popular. He was a great. I mean, he should have been president. But, well, okay. Anyway, a Public Enemy, this band, it was kind of, they had a almost completely white audience as a rap group. So there's also a lot of fear of this spreading out from a minority to a majority.
Right.
But do you think there's I'm anxious of what's going to happen now, because there's a lot of stuff happening and people are organizing, but there must be some backlash after some time. And I'm a bit afraid because America is a wild country and everybody has weapons and stuff like that. So what do you think about it?
Good question. There will be a backlash. Let me state that unequivocally. There will be a backlash. No question about that. And it's building. You can see its embryonic form. And there's two different types of backlash. Let's be mindful about that and be very clear about that. One, there's a major effort by liberal forces in the Democratic Party to contain the motion to the greatest extent possible. Like they want to just channel it to narrow reforms, right? So we don't want to, one of the most elevated demands that have emerged in the last 3 weeks is defund the police, right? That's come out of what we call a prison abolitionist framework, that's really been articulated by organizations the last 25 years, like Critical Resistance, which was organized by a number of anarchists, and communists in the main, who've been putting that out. So this is a call really towards abolition. But they've been trying to water it down and say, well, defund doesn't mean defund. The word is not what we mean is not what the word actually says. And what it means is just redirecting resources from the police into other things. And so they're trying to create really, in essence, kind of like a two-line struggle on what should be the progressive side. One was to say we can have reform within the system and the system can change. And the other line saying, no, ultimately this whole thing has to be abolished. So that's one form of a backlash, this kind of containment motion, and they're trying to redirect everything they can to just stay within the 2020 presidential elections and the congressional elections, and just everybody just put Democrats in charge of the president and the Senate, and then we'll tweak a few things here and there, but in essence, fundamentally, nothing will change. They're shooting themselves in the foot with that because Biden is there right now, their lead man. They may change that, but their lead man is out there saying, well, I'm not for defunding the police, and then put forth a proposal that, in fact, they should have more resources on the federal level. That's what he basically said 2 or 3 days ago. So he's just turning off black youth. So there's no way they're going to be able to count on a major black mobilization. I mean, they kind of take the black vote for granted anyway, because it's always this notion like you have no place else to go. So no matter how bad we are, it's kind of the other side is worse. So you'll just all lie. A lot of young folks are already saying they're not going with that. So they're really putting themselves in danger. So that's one type of reaction we need to be clear about, this limitation. Then there's the hard right, the far right reaction. It's been a bit scattered, since this all took off. But Trump, I think, is playing it very well, and we need to be very mindful of how skillful he is. He gave his first statement, kind of national statement, yesterday, and he doubled down on that the police force need to dominate. This is his language. The police need to dominate the streets. That's his literal language. Which comes out of a segregationist call that was taken up in the 1960s by a police officer in Florida. So he did that very intentionally. He's a good student of history. People think he's an idiot, but he's actually a very good student of history, and he chose that very deliberately. And then he announced that he's going to do his first campaign rally on Juneteenth. Right now, Juneteenth, so your audience knows, is a kind of unofficial holiday, a holiday in Black America, because it commemorates when the news hit Texas that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. The slaveholders in Texas, remember there were the old school digital telegraph things, but there was no internet or anything like that back in those days. So things largely had to spread word of mouth. So from the time it took from carriages, horse-drawn carriages and ships to go from DC to parts of what would be now East Texas, to let folks know that, the federal government has given this insurrection order. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation really was encouraging, enslaved Africans to revolt, right, against their slave masters. That didn't reach word there and for like several months later in June. And so it was Juneteenth kind of was created in honor of that. Well, Donald Trump is holding his first, post-COVID-19 rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Juneteenth. So that's just a smack in the face of Juneteenth and what it symbolizes. But deeper still, the piece around Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was one of the so-called worst race riots in American history that happened there in 1921. So he's sending a very clear message, right, that I am all for putting my foot down and stomping out this movement. And what he's doing, he's been building the case really for the development of a brown shirt force. Right. And he's been doing that for months. I think very craftily, very skillfully. Like one of the things he said that really, I think, kind of heightened and elevated, I think he miscalculated, is when he came out and did his first statement saying, I'm your law and order president, right? And he basically just literally stole the words from Richard Nixon's mouth, thinking that play would work again, and that he could bank on the vast majority of white people being all for the repression of the upsurge. to the same degree that they were in the 1960s. So that's what Nixon's presidency represented, right? A suppression of the motion from the 1960s. So he already has called and revoked that and saying, I'm gonna do exactly what we've historically done to Black rebellion, which is crush it. But he said a thing in there, you know, he invoked martial law and that was threatening enough. But he said something in there, which was, I'm going to protect and uphold your Second Amendment rights. It was a small little thing, but students who love history like myself are like, I caught that and I know exactly what that means. Whose Second Amendment rights? The Second Amendment rights that he's trying to uphold are the brown shirt forces, the forces that he encouraged to disrupt all of the shutdown motions and ask folks to come out in armed droves, you know, to protest the states being shut down and trying to force them back open. And you saw before all this, you know, in April and May, you know, they started to unleash the dogs and started to have these actions wherein they had these armed militia who were storming courthouses in Virginia, Kentucky, and in Michigan, demanding that states reopen and threatening, in particular, the lives of the black legislatures. My mom said to wait. The black legislators, you know, in all of those states. So his call on Juneteenth, this piece that he's going to do, and Juneteenth is next Friday, June 19th. His call is a marshaling of the brown shirt forces. That's what it is. I mean, we need to be very clear about that, and I think he's viewing this as he's going to put all of those far-right reactionary forces into counter motion to suppress the mass movement, you know, that we've witnessed the last couple of weeks. That's what he's going to do. So there's going to for sure be a counter motion coming from Trump of that and the right wing. I mean, Trump again is just symptomatic of a deeper problem. But they're going to call those forces out, and it will be interesting to see what happens because there's a serious fight that's going on within the armed forces in the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, people should be clear about that. There are a number of police who are actually raising their voice and fighting back against some of the tactics that's going on. There's a decent degree of motion being called for by active military and reserve military about, you know, not following the orders that are being given, to operate in the streets and to repress people. So there's some, you know, Trump and his forces are not quite sure they can rely on all of those forces, right? That if they give certain commands, they can't rely on those forces. And this is why I'm saying this piece on Juneteenth is going to be a call out to the brown shirt forces, because those are forces that they feel that they could trust at a particular period like this. And he would like nothing better, I think, at this point than to just create to create. Oh, let me start this again so you guys can have the audio. Then to create chaos. Because it's pretty clear, I think, at this point that his chances of re-election are slim. Now, before all of this happened, I thought for sure Trump would get re-elected. Now, he may still get re-elected. But I think there's a real move that if their backup plan, the far right's backup plan, I think is to cancel the elections and basically rule by decree, institute a coup. You know, there's open conversation about that here in Mississippi and in other places in the Deep South. So it's not like this is an abstract conversation. This is an active conversation that's happening amongst far right forces, and we need to take it seriously.
Okay, Bart, do you have another question or?
No,
we ask,
I can go on. We can go on for hours about.
Can we ask Kali finally for maybe some positive statement to encourage people a little bit, because the last things that you said were kind of disturbing, of course. I mean, sure, we have to be careful. We have to be very vigilant and stuff like that. But please give us some good vibes.
Well, look, this is a historic moment. I think momentum is on our side. We need folks to stay in the streets, but we need also folks to take it deeper. So one of the things that, People Strike is encouraging everybody to do all over the world. Number one, to get with this proposal, educate yourself about what Juneteenth is, and wherever you are, Amsterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, wherever. Take up some, do some Juneteenth actions, and in them uplift, the work stoppage piece that's coming from the ILWU, which is the West Coast Longshoremen's Union. They're going to be shutting down all the ports in Alaska, the West Coast, and Hawaii on Juneteenth. Very powerful action. So we need all workers to join in on that, and all communities to join in on that. And what we are putting forth as a People Strike is we're calling them and supporting it. What we're calling for everybody to do as the next critical step in this struggle is to take up some real conversations in what we're calling people's assemblies or popular assemblies. Put a call out for that, and organize those in your community on July 1st, so that's done in tandem with motion all over the world, and take up some critical questions. They'll be a little bit different in every place. Here in the United States, we're asking folks in general to take up 3 questions in these assemblies. One is about decolonization and what their program means. We're really defining that in line with indigenous organizers and positions here in the United States, for a total reorganization of society. Have a serious conversation about what abolition means, right? And raise those questions, as broad questions of demilitarizing society and making it more democratic. I think that's true. It needs to happen everywhere. And the last question is, let's have a serious conversation about what is it going to take to build what we're calling a regenerative economy, right? An eco-socialist economy. What would it take to organize ourselves and shift and democratize the means of production? We need to have these conversations everywhere. We want to encourage everybody to do that. There's going to be some considerable motion around that. If we keep up that motion, dig deeper amongst ourselves, organize ourselves, I think we can make some serious headway against all these right-wing forces, and not have to move from positions of fear or concern, but move from a position of strength to recreate a new world, because I think we're on the cusp of that. That's where we're at.
Kali, thank you very much. From Jackson, Mississippi. I hope we can talk to you some time soon, and keep up the good fight.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.